Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for another conversation. We're happy that you're here. If you joined us last week, you probably heard that Laura is out of town this week. She's on a business trip, so is not going to be able to join us for tonight's conversation. And she had given the option if I wanted to go on and do it, or if we would just cancel for tonight. And initially I thought we would probably just cancel, but then there was something that the Lord shared with me this past week that I was really excited about, and some conversations that I've had with him about it. And so I just wanted to take this opportunity to share some of them and talk about them with you. So I'm excited that you're joining us tonight for the conversation. And as always, just welcome you to join in the chat. You can put in comments if you have questions, if you have prayer requests, if you have praise reports. We're more than happy to pray for your requests. We're more than happy to rejoice with you and thank God for the answers to prayer and what he's doing in your lives. And if you have questions regarding what we talk about tonight, you can put those in the chat as well. Now, as usual, when it's only me here, I may not always see all the comments. Sometimes there's a little delay in seeing them on my computer, and sometimes just when I am doing the talking, I can't always do the typing at the same time. I am not the greatest when it comes to typing to begin with, so I just thank you for bearing with me and just want you to be assured that if you do have comments and I do not respond during the live show, that I will respond to you afterward. And so we're going to get into tonight's conversation, and we're going to have a conversation tonight talking about do be pushy. Do be pushy. Well, I guess I'll start off with something that kind of made me laugh. I do a lot of driving for my job, and especially during the summer months, get behind these big construction trucks and sometimes big tractor trailers that have these heavy loads. And I've just noticed recently on several of them a sign that says, do not push. Do not push. And I have to sit there and laugh because I'm thinking, you're at least 3 times my size. I'm not even going to try and push you. But it just really got me thinking about pushing forward. And hi, Pam. It's good to see you tonight. Thank you for joining. And so we're talking about do be pushy. And there's those times where we need to push forward. But sometimes, I don't know about you, but you face those situations in your life and they make you feel uncomfortable. They're less than ideal. Maybe your current circumstances, they seem contradictory to prospering. And we might question, God, unless you change something, there's no way I can push forward. There's no way I can prosper. You've got to change the circumstances and then I can push forward. Well, maybe it's time to get a little pushy. Yeah, I don't like driving past those big trucks either, Pam. I'm glad I'm not the only one. I wouldn't try pushing them, but we're talking tonight about a different sense of pushing forward. And so when we talk about maybe it's time to get a little pushy, now I don't know about you, but when I hear that, I remember growing up and my parents telling me and other people telling me, don't you be pushy. Don't be pushy. It seemed like a negative thing. You ever encounter those people that it seems like they're pushing you into doing something? Maybe you go into a store and you're there to purchase one thing. You go to a car lot and you have certain features and things that you're looking for, and the salesman how often tries to sell you something more, push you into something more, and you feel like they're getting a little pushy. And sometimes, I don't know about you, but it pushes me away. I just don't like feeling like someone is being pushy toward me. But as I was having these conversations with the Lord about some things I've been studying recently, he gave a different light on pushing forward. And I was very surprised by the scriptures that we're going to look at tonight in the context of pushing forward and prospering. You know, I've often thought about, well, people who are pushy aren't going to prosper because, like I said, if I go into a store or I go somewhere where I feel like someone's being pushy, I tend to want to walk out without buying anything. I think there's no way they're going to be successful, no way they're going to be prosperous. Yep, I'm with you, Pam. And so I think that being pushy isn't going to lead to prosperity. But we're going to look at an interesting definition of prospering here in what we talk about tonight and how it relates to pushing forward. And so we're going to look tonight at an example from the book of Genesis, chapter 39. And we're going to look at a person named Joseph. And I don't know, many of you, at least who are a regular part of our audience, you're probably familiar with the account of Joseph in the book of Genesis. He was someone who, he was the favorite child of their dad. He had 11 brothers and at least one sister that we know of, and he was dad's favorite. And when he was a young person, God gave him dreams. And Joseph was a little bit young and immature at the time, and so he said to his family, he said, I had these dreams and you're all going to bow down to me. And they didn't like that. And so they ended up selling him, and he was taken into the nation of Egypt. And so he was in some difficult situations. It certainly, to me, doesn't look like a place where anyone's going to be able to prosper. He was sold by his brothers. He was sold into servitude. He was sold into a place taken away from his people. But God had given him dreams. God had given him promises. Where's Laura tonight? She's on a business trip, so she's out of town and unable to be with us tonight. And so Joseph, he's there, and he's in Egypt. And I want to look at a scripture that God really used to speak to me about pushing forward, about prospering in those situations where we think there's no way I can prosper, no way I can push forward in this type of situation. And just see, I mean, as I said, if anyone has anything you want to share in the chat related to this, please do so. And again, if I don't see it at the time, it doesn't mean that we don't notice or appreciate what you're sharing. I just can't always keep track of the chat at the same time as talking, but please share if you have any relevant experiences. And so in Genesis 39, Joseph, we're told in verse 1, Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the hands of the Ishmaelites, which brought him down. And this is the verse that God really used, that God really hit me with. Verse 2 of Genesis 39 says, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Do you pick up on that? It's an and Joseph. He was taken down to Egypt, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous person, and he was in the house of his master. Now, I don't know about you, but when I first read that, I'm thinking, and they seem like contradictory, especially the last two. And he was a prosperous man, and he was in his master's house. I'm looking and thinking, that doesn't seem like a very likely place to prosper. If I were Joseph, I would probably be thinking, God, how can I be prosperous when I'm in this place where I was sold into servitude? into a foreign nation away from my family, I can't be prosperous. It seems to me more like an but or an or statement. I'll be prosperous or I'll be in my master's house, but I can't be both at the same time. I don't know if anyone's ever found yourself in a situation like that where you know that you want to push forward, but it seems like the position you're in, the circumstances at the time, it's like, I don't know how I can push forward, how I can prosper when I'm in a place where I'm not comfortable, that doesn't seem like a place where anyone could prosper. How could Joseph prosper in his master's house? Well, first of all, it says, and the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in his master's house. And I want to look at that word prosper, because this is where the do be pushy comes into play. And I was surprised when I was reading and studying this, and I was talking to the Lord. I was talking to the Lord about some specific situations in my life right now where I question, God, how can I prosper? It seems like you've got to change something first. We have this new church plant, and with a new church plant, you don't have a lot of people who are already skilled, knowledgeable in technology, in designing websites, in basically a lot of the different tasks. And so some of the things I was asked to do, building a website, I'm thinking, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that. This is an uncomfortable situation to me. I don't see how. But God led me to the scripture. And it's like the Lord was with Joseph, and Joseph was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master. And the next verse says, and his master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. And I'm thinking, God, it's not an or situation. It's an and. And you're with me, and I can be prosperous, and be in a situation that's uncomfortable, that doesn't seem ideal for prospering. And so we look at that word. What does it mean to be prosperous? Well, I ask you, what do you typically think of when you hear the word prosper, prosperity, prosperous? I know typically I would think, well, the big one, lots of money. Prospering means you're rich. You got a lot of money. And in the dictionary, oh, thank you, Teresa. Thank you. And it was God who gave the ability to prosper. And it just is one small example of what we're going to talk about tonight when you're in situations where you feel like you can't prosper. Often we think of prospering as being rich, being wealthy. And in the dictionary, it has meanings, first of all, is auspicious or favorable, marked by success or economic well-being, or enjoying vigorous and healthy growth, flourishing. So, like I said, what do you usually think of when you hear the word prospering or prosperity? Are you like me? You think of usually the financial end, the physical stuff. Well, I just had to laugh as I'm looking this up in Strong's, this word in the Strong's Concordance. And the definition of prosper in these verses is to push forward. To push forward. And I'm thinking, God, this is not at all what I thought when it says, and Joseph was a prosperous man. And you made all that he did to prosper that was in his hand. You think being rich? That's what I usually think, first of all, Pam. Yeah, being rich. But in this context, in the scripture, when God made Joseph prosperous, when he made him to prosper, God made him to push forward in a difficult situation, in a difficult place. When he was sold into a nation, a foreign nation, taken away from his family in a place that didn't seem like he could push forward. Everything that Joseph put his hand to, God caused to prosper, to push forward. And I just sat there, wow, God, that puts a whole different light on this scripture. And when I think of you causing everything in our hand to prosper. So Joseph, we can see how God allowed him to prosper, how God caused him to push forward despite the circumstances, in the difficult circumstances. In Genesis 39, it continues to show us some of the ways that God caused him to prosper. We're told that Joseph, he found grace in his master's sight, that his master made him overseer over all of his house. Everything that his master had, he put into Joseph's hand. And God blessed Potiphar's house because of Joseph. And the blessing was on everything in the house and everything in the field. And Potiphar left all he had into Joseph's hand. He didn't even know what all he had, except what he ate. And Joseph was goodly and well favored. We can see how he pushed forward. He's in his master's house. It couldn't have been a comfortable place. And yet God caused him to push forward. God caused him to prosper in that difficult situation. And then if you go further, yes, Pam, David was another person, right? We can see throughout Scripture of people that God caused to push forward and to prosper. And in Joseph's case, further on in Genesis 39, we see eventually Joseph was put into prison because his master's wife, well, I appreciate you thinking, Pam, and I appreciate you sharing. Thank you. And so Joseph, he was put into the prison because his master's wife wrongly accused him, saying Joseph came on to her and tried to seduce her when she was the one trying to seduce him, and he ran away, and she wrongly accused him, and Joseph was put into prison. But we can see again here, he's in a prison. He's in a prison. How many of you think of prospering, of pushing forward when you're in a prison? Whether it's a actual physical prison, or many of us, we found ourselves in some type of bondage, bound by something at some point in our lives, and we think, how can I push forward with this tying my hands, with this holding me down, holding me back? How can I push forward? Well, God caused Joseph to prosper in the prison. We're told in Genesis 39 that Joseph's master put him into prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the prison keeper. And the prison keeper committed all that he had into Joseph's hand, all of the prisoners. And whatever they did, Joseph was the one who was in charge of it. And the keeper of the prison, like Potiphar, didn't even know what was everything in his hand. Because the Lord was with Joseph, and what he did, the Lord made to prosper. So again, when we find ourselves in those times, in those situations where they seem incompatible with prospering, incompatible with pushing forward, I just laughed as I'm reading through this Genesis 39. It says and, not but, not or, and. And I just love that. I'm reading it thinking, how could Joseph prosper? How could he push forward? Well, if any of you have some of the questions I did, how can we push forward? How can we prosper when we're in the situations that are uncomfortable, when we're in those difficult times, when we're wrongly accused and we're the ones who seem to suffer the consequences of that? Well, I want to look at a couple key things in Joseph's situation and just talk about how We can see them in our own lives. Remember, the Lord was with Joseph, and the Lord made all that Joseph did to prosper. And Joseph, I want us to hear this. He will help us. You're right. He will help us, Pam. And that's one of the key words. He will help us. The third point that I was just ready to get to, you beat me to it, Pam, that Joseph had to put his hand to it. And what he put his hand to, God caused to prosper. He had to put his hand to it. It says God caused to prosper. God caused to push forward everything that Joseph put his hand to. Sometimes, I don't know about you, but I find myself like, God, you just got to get me out of this situation. God, you just got to change the situation. I don't want to put my hand to something, but I want God to just do it. Just do it. But sometimes he wants us to put our hand to it. And then he will cause it to prosper. He will cause us to push forward. And it may not look like what we're expecting it to look like. Again, I think back to the typical definition I think of with prospering as compared to how Strong's defines it, at least in the context of this passage. When God causes us to prosper, to push forward, it's not always going to look like the worldly view of prosperity, but he will cause us to prosper what we put our hand to when he is with us. So I want to look at 3 P's of prospering, 3 P's of pushing forward. And the first 3 that we're going to look at are the ones that probably don't feel so good, don't sound so good to us. I know they don't sound that good to me. But 3 P's of prospering, of pushing forward. First of all, pushing forward, prospering, it often involves pain. I don't like hearing that. I don't know about you. Pushing forward, prospering involves pain. If we look at Joseph's experiences, yes, he will never leave us. But sometimes we go through a lot of pain, and he's with us through that, just as he was with Joseph. Joseph, who was betrayed by his brothers, who was sold by his brothers who initially were going to kill him, and then sold him into the servitude to a foreign nation. Joseph, who was wrongly accused by his master's wife. Joseph, who was thrown into prison because of those accusations, even though he was innocent. Joseph, who later on, when he was in prison, God used him to interpret the dreams of some of Pharaoh's servants who were also in the prison. And the one who was eventually released, Joseph said before he got out, remember me when you get out. And basically he's saying, get me out of here. Tell Pharaoh that I interpreted your dreams and get me out of here. And it says in the scripture that the butler forgot about Joseph. So he was forgotten about after he had interpreted those dreams. And so Joseph experienced quite a bit of pain in the process, quite a bit of pain as he's pushing forward, as he's being prospered by God. So do we know that often pushing forward, prospering, is going to involve pain? In John 16:21, I want to read this from the Passion Translation. I haven't personally been through this, so I may not be the biggest one to listen to, but you ladies who have been through it, what's one of the most painful things to go through? Childbirth. Giving birth to children involves pain as you're delivering that child. In John 16:21, it says, just like a woman given birth experiences intense labor pains in delivering her baby, yet after the child is born, she quickly forgets what she went through because of the overwhelming joy of knowing that a new baby has been born into the world. And this just made me think of when we're talking about pushing forward in the context of prospering. A woman in childbirth, what's one word? At least I know this is a TV show, so ladies who've gone through it, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but on the TV shows, what do you hear them often saying? Push, push, push. And so it just made me think of this scripture. A woman giving birth experiences extreme pain as she's delivering, as she's pushing forward, pushing that child to the birth. Thanks, Pam. Oh, yeah. You had natural childbirth 6 times? Wow. So you probably experienced this then. Did you ever hear? Did they ever tell you, Pam, was one of the things they said, push, 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 as you're delivering those babies? Yep, push, push, push. So that pain involved as you're pushing forth. But in the end, you have this child and you forget the pain because you've got this new life in your arms. That pushing forward, it involves pain. And in our own lives, it may not be the physical pain related to childbirth, but like Joseph, we all go through painful situations. We all go through painful times, but we can push forward through them. God is with us. As you said earlier, Pam, God is with us in those times to push forward, and in the end, to have that reward. And so, pushing forward involves pain. Another P, another one that many of us don't like to hear. Pushing forward, prospering requires patience. We probably all have heard something along the lines of, I'm not praying for patience because that means I'm going to be tested to develop it. Some of us, patience, it's a fruit of the Spirit. Patience, but being patient, pushing forward, prospering, it requires patience. And we can see that in Joseph's life. But first, again, another kind of definition thing that made me smile, because it's not at all what I typically think of. How would you define patience? Patience, a lot of times in the dictionary definition we think of, it's something like basically waiting, and going through and keeping calm through it and being patient. Well, a lot of times in Scripture, when that word patience is used, it means, this is according to Strong's, cheerful or hopeful endurance or constancy. Cheerful or hopeful endurance and constancy. So when we talk about prospering, pushing forward requires patience, it's that cheerful, hopeful endurance or constancy. And again, if we look at Joseph, yeah, he did a lot of waiting, Pam, but he continued pushing forward as he waited. He continued pushing forward. He had those dreams from God. He had those things that had hold on to. He knew that God was with him through it. And so he could have that hope, that cheer to endure, to be constant. Everything that was put into his hands, God caused to prosper, to push forward. And he could do that. And so, in our own lives, when we find ourselves in those times, in those situations, it can seem like it's a long time. It's a long time. And we think, I just got to be patient. I just got to be patient. Well, it's not sitting there. Oh, I'm being patient. I'm being patient. But it's that cheerful, hopeful constancy in the process. It's trusting God in the process, believing, hoping in those promises that he's given us, and knowing that he is with us. Joseph exhibited a lot of patience as God is causing him to push forward, to prosper in everything he put his hand to. He was constant. He endured even when the circumstances seemed hopeless. He continued to be faithful with everything that he was entrusted with by his master, by the prison keeper. He continued to be faithful, even though he was wrongly accused, even though it looked like he may never get out of there, even though he was forgotten about by the butler. He continued to be constant, to endure, to hope in God's promises. And so if we find ourselves in those situations, and we're like, God, how can I push forward? How can I prosper in this? It's been a long time. It's been a long time, and it seems like I'm just getting hit with one thing after another. I'm getting hit with wrongful accusations. I'm getting hit with attacks. I'm getting hit with things coming against me. But yet to continue to hope in what God's spoken, in those promises he's given. Continue and believe that he's with me and he'll cause me to prosper through this. And then the third P of prospering, of pushing forward. Pushing forward, prospering, is a part of preparation. It's a part of preparation. Yes, his promises are totally amazing for us. They are totally amazing for us. And so we can push forward. We can prosper, knowing it's preparation. It's preparation. God had given Joseph dreams, and they were from God, and they would come to pass. But there was a period of preparation involved to get him to the point of being ready for those promises. Preparation doesn't always feel good. But do we know that if God is with us, that we can push forward, trusting that he is preparing us, and he's preparing the other people and the circumstances for his time, And sometimes there's things in that preparation that he's got to work out of us. Some areas we've got to grow, some areas we've got to mature. Remember Joseph, he had these dreams and he was a youngin', and he's telling all of his family about these dreams, and they're like, you're a cocky little one, aren't you? And it probably wasn't the time for him to speak them. And so God took him through some preparation. But those promises, they're from God. He's faithful to his promises. And so Joseph went through preparation. Each step along the way, it may not have looked like preparation. I would think about Joseph. Oftentimes I read these accounts in the Bible, and it sounds like, as you read it, that Joseph really never experienced any type of real human emotion. I'm like, it just always depicts him as being faithful. You don't see him asking any questions. And I'm like, come on, what was he really going through? Did he ever have questions? Like, God, come on. Here I am. I've been wrongfully accused. Here I am. I've been put into a place where I don't deserve to be. Come on, this is taking so long. You've given these dreams. But we can experience those times where we wonder, God, what are you doing here? God, are you even doing anything here? But he was with Joseph and he was being prepared. He was being prepared. It may not have looked like it at the time. He's sold into Egypt. He's sold to a foreign master who's not someone who believes in his God. And yet God caused him to prosper. And this man, Potiphar, he was a pretty powerful man. He was high up there in the nation of Egypt. So it may have seemed like a good position. And it was. And then Joseph lands in prison. He gets thrown into prison. It may seem like, okay, it may have seemed like preparation. I was in at least a higher up person's home and you were prospering me, God, but now here I am in a prison. It seems like a step back. But yet God was preparing him. God was preparing him. And he was preparing him for the time that would come when he would be released from that prison and go to the palace, go before Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt and influential throughout the known world at that time. It was preparation. It was preparation, but I don't know about you. Sometimes it's hard to go through that preparation because it does not feel good. It involves purging. It involves pruning. It involves us surrendering, having to surrender to God fully, having to let go of some things that we may have held on to, having to grow up and mature in him. But the preparation, it's oh so worth it. And to remain faithful. Joseph remained faithful. He remained faithful throughout that period of preparation, throughout that period. And so do we know that pushing forward, that prospering, the 3 P's that don't feel good, that aren't comfortable, that many of us don't like to hear. Pushing forward, prospering involves pain, requires patience, and is a part of preparation. In Psalm 105, 19-21, again, I'll read it from the Passion Translation, speaks of how God was preparing Joseph. God's promises to Joseph purged his character until it was time for his dreams to come true. And eventually the king of Egypt sent for him, setting him free at last. So there we see pain, we see patience, and we see preparation. And then Joseph was put in charge of everything under the king, and he became the master of the palace over all of the royal possessions. So Joseph, he went through pain, he displayed patience, and he went through time of preparation. And that same thing is available to us. If we find ourselves in situations, or when we find ourselves in those times where we don't know how we're going to prosper, when it seems like there's no way I can prosper unless God changes, there's no way, and God is with me, and I prosper, and I remain in this situation. It involves pain, patience, and preparation. But there's one final P that I want to talk about and close with here. If we put our hand and are faithful to what we're entrusted to, knowing that God is with us, if we push forward with God, it will lead to the promise. It will lead to the promise. And it can come suddenly, and it comes at God's appointed time. In Genesis 41:1, and this is while Joseph is still in the prison, after Joseph had interpreted the dreams of the butler, and he said to the butler, "Go, tell Pharaoh, remember me. Go tell Pharaoh, remember me and get me out of this place. And the butler forgot Joseph. It says, and it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. And that just hit me as I was reading that. 2 full years. It came to pass after 2 full years. That's 2 full years after Joseph had interpreted the dream of the butler. 2 full years after he thought, this is surely my time to get out of this prison. When this butler goes and tells Pharaoh what I did I interpret his dream accurately? When he goes and tells him that, it's going to get me out of here. And then the butler goes and forgets about Joseph once he gets restored to his position for 2 full years. For 2 full years. And it just made me think about the fullness of time. And Scripture talks about in the fullness of time, God sent his Son. In the fullness of time, at his appointed time, when everything is accomplished that needs to be accomplished, when we go through the pain, when we have the patience, and when we're prepared in the fullness of time, at God's appointed time. After 2 full years, it seemed like a long time to Joseph, I'm sure, a lot longer even than 2 full years. But after 2 full years, Pharaoh had this dream, and no one else could interpret it. He went to his magicians, he went to different people in Egypt, and no one could interpret these dreams. And then the butler remembered Joseph, and he told Pharaoh. And after he told Pharaoh, it says in Genesis 41:14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily, quickly, suddenly out of the dungeon. Does that hit you like it hit me? I'm there thinking, wow, God, the suddenlies of God. He had endured pain. He displayed patience. He went through a long period of preparation. And at your appointed time, hastily, suddenly, they bring him out of the dungeon, and he's led into the palace where Pharaoh appointed him to be in charge of everything in the nation of Egypt, second only under him himself. And God caused the promises to come to pass. Wow. Wow. So today you find yourself in a place where you question, God, are you even doing anything here? But you have a promise from God. As I was reading this and having this conversation with God about this, I was just remembering how I was in psychiatric hospitals for many years. And then toward the end, I knew I had promises from God. I knew that he had set me free. And yet I was still remained in the psychiatric hospitals. Similar to Joseph, I thought, well, I'm surely going to get out of here now because I'd had an encounter with God. I knew he changed me, and I'm telling people this. And I'm thinking they'll go to the doctors and they'll tell them, and I'll get out of here. But instead, I was sent back to a state hospital. But I had the promises of God, and I knew he was with me. God revealed that to me. He showed me, and I was able to say, God, I don't believe I need this. But I know if I do go, that you go with me. He was with me. And there was a long period of pain, and it required patience. But it was preparation. And then it was a suddenly of God. And then at his appointed time, he brought me out of there. And he brought me out of there for good. And so I just hope that tonight, anyone who's watching live, or if you watch the recording, that this brings encouragement to you. It's time, maybe it's time to be pushy. Maybe it's time to be pushy. Not in the sense we often think of it that kind of is off-putting to people, but be push forward. Push forward. He did release me, Pam, but push forward tonight, if you find yourself in those situations where it seems like, I don't know how I'm going to prosper. I don't know how I'm going to push forward. First of all, know that God is with you. That Jesus promised never to leave or forsake us. And knowing that he's with us, put your hand to whatever you're entrusted with. Be faithful with that. And he will cause it to prosper. He will cause you to push forward, and know that it will involve pain. Know that it will require patience. Know that it's part of his preparation. But know that if you do push forward with him, that it will lead to the promise. So I just pray God's blessing upon you tonight. Know that we love you, and Lord willing, Laura and I will both be back with you next Tuesday. So God bless you. Good night.